Welcome to message number 3 of our summer Bible playlist, Waiting. Today's message is entitled Waiting, something we have all become quite accustomed to over the last year. Waiting to see loved ones, waiting not to wear a mask, waiting for our vaccination appointments, and of course waiting for our provinces to finally allow visits from family across the country. 2020 and now 2021 has been all about waiting. So much of life is spent waiting for the next thing. And waiting seems to be harder the more that we have our eyes set on that next thing. It's like being put on hold when you call a support line and someone who, well, it seems never really studied the psychology of disappointment, voices over the serene muzak playing in the background. Our present caller volume is high. You're caller 1000 of 1001. And you're just sitting there saying, what? I'm convinced that the reason they give you that message is because they just want half the people to hang up immediately. All this to say, the very obvious thing, we don't like waiting. When we think of the word wait list, we don't choose adjectives like beautiful or coveted to describe that word. No, we actually would more opt for dreaded. It much better describes our feelings about the idea of waiting. What is it about waiting that we just find so irritating? Why is it that when we see the long line or the traffic jam, our heart just sinks? I'm sure there are many reasons, actually, and I think, though, that they're rooted in this experience of nothingness. We just feel like we're caught in between things. We're not resting, we're not enjoying ourselves, we're neither here or there. We're not accomplishing things to check off our to-do list. Waiting is a form of just being stuck in our minds. Sometimes it's unexpected too, which means we haven't even prepared ourselves for the frustration of nothingness. I think sometimes because we experience waiting in this way, we push ourselves into that experience of frustration. And of course, it doesn't have to be a waiting line. Sometimes we're just in between things in life. Maybe we're between jobs, or we're stuck in the middle of a pandemic. We experienced a blockade here in New Brunswick on the Trans-Canada, or I guess Nova Scotia, just this last week. And the reason why? Ultimately, because people are tired of waiting. Some people have called this in-between space liminal space. And it's taken from that time before the sun rises or sets. It's not quite morning or night. It certainly isn't fully one or the other. We're in between. It's too light to do things that require darkness, and it's too dark to do things that require light. It's just simply in between. It's kind of a nothing time. It's a temporary space of no longer and not yet. The thing is, we can't control this. No matter how much frustration or anger or sadness, nothing is going to change the reality that we get stuck in this in-between space, waiting. So it doesn't matter whether we're anxious to get started a new task or whether we're sad we didn't get finished the task that we were working on. It really doesn't matter. It is what it is. We are stuck in that liminal space. So what are we to do in these liminal spaces of life, these times that we don't really control, and yet we find ourselves just waiting? One thing that the Bible teaches us is that in our waiting, we're to frame it differently. We're to think about it differently. We're to see it as waiting on the Lord. Over and over again in the Bible, we read this phrase, waiting on the Lord. And we see that in our reading today from Psalm 130, verse 5, which says, I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in His word I hope. This word of hope is something that we need to hear. Waiting or being caught in the in-between moment can create anger in us, where we are seeking to blame something or even someone for our situation. And anger is natural. It's a natural response to fear and anxiety. And we don't like those things. We don't like those feelings of anxiety and fear. And so we quickly become angry about it. And sometimes the person or situation that brought us to that place. But it doesn't help us in those liminal places. We're still there. And when we're experiencing this fear and anxiety, I think what we need to do is just take a deep breath. And in that moment, we need to give ourselves and our feelings and our situation over to the Lord. And it's in His faithfulness that we can have hope. In another psalm, Psalm 27, we read the words, "Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord." In this text, we see the words "be strong" and "take courage," and this idea of waiting for the Lord. One thing that can help us in these moments is just to be in that moment, to put aside in our minds and our hearts what we just left behind and what we're anticipating ahead, and just experience the present as it is. And as we do this, we usually find some beauty in that moment. Not always, but quite often we do. One of my favorite photos from last year, or maybe it was the year before, is a picture from the deck of my dad's cottage in Cascompec, PEI. I was enjoying the sunset. It was so beautiful, and I wanted to get a picture. So, of course, since my daughter Rebecca was there, she's the photographer among us, I asked her to take a picture for me. And it was not yet night, and it was no longer day. It was just one of those beautiful visual experiences of 2020 for me. But to see that, you have to stop wishing for the coming night and grieving for the loss of the day. You have to pause and appreciate the moment for what it is. I think it's when we pause and wait and open our eyes in the moment that we can experience some things that we will not experience otherwise. Let's look at a couple of things that can happen when we move ourselves into a place where we wholeheartedly wait on the Lord. And for this, I'm going to draw on some other verses in our summer Bible playlist, starting with 2 Samuel verse 1, then Lamentations 3, and then the story of Jairus in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. So, waiting for God. The first thing we see from this are unexpected ends. We learn that sometimes things happen that we just didn't expect. We plan for one thing, but yet something else happens. Sometimes it's tragically different. I mean, when David, in this 2 Samuel 1, he spent years waiting to be king. He had been anointed by the prophet Samuel, and yet Saul was still the king, and he was still the anointed one. And David understood that while Saul was living, Saul was the king. And David had many opportunities to kill Saul, but he chose not to because he believed that Saul was the Lord's anointed. As long as he was alive, he was king. Now, when this finally happened, it was a mixed blessing for David. On the one hand, Saul was killed in battle, honorable death in the ancient world, but yet by his side was David's very best friend, Jonathan, who also died with his father. So David becomes king of Israel, but it's a bittersweet experience for him. The death of his greatest enemy, yes, but also of his greatest friend. And David grieves the loss of his friend, and he's even angered by the death of Saul at the hands of the enemies of Israel. But he's prepared spiritually for whatever happens, because in that moment he's trusting God, just as he had been trusting God through this whole waiting time that he had found himself in for years. Unexpected endings are a part of our lives. We wait, and then when something finally moves, something finally happens, it's not the ideal future that we were hoping for. Not all of our plans are going to work out just as we had hoped. And when our plans get derailed, sometimes we get stuck. It's a short distance, really, from disappointment to fear, and from fear to anxiety, and from anxiety to anger. A terrible mix of emotions that make the in-between times extra unpleasant. Even though most of us in our life experiences already know that even without the hiccups, things don't work out exactly the way we expected. Sometimes better, oftentimes worse. But most of the time, just different. And this is why, as we wait on the Lord, who knows the future and who holds all things in his hands, we can have this unshakable confidence. You see, having confidence in God in the in-between times is rooted more in who God is than what God does. When we focus on what God does, we often get discouraged because, well, to say it bluntly, we don't understand all the variables in play in running the universe. Now, this really shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, intellectually at least, but emotionally, it always hits us hard. You know, it's like when that loved one who is suffering from advanced dementia just rips into you angrily and says things that are so hurtful. Now, mentally, we know that that's not really our loved one talking. That's just their brain going nuts with all kinds of synaptic activity that they can't control. But yet our hearts still ache of those words from that familiar voice coming toward us. Sometimes our intellect and our emotions aren't really in sync. And so even though we know that the universe has a lot of variables and God is doing everything to work it out in the end for the best, it still can be tragic and unpleasant and hurtful at times. Think of the fall of Jerusalem in that book of Lamentations where all those laments were written to God. I mean, Israel was being taken into captivity and they were defeated in every way. Those who stayed in the land thought that God was being favorable to them because they got to stay in the land. And the Babylonian exiles thought that they were the ones being punished. But in the end, though, I mean, as we read the story through, we realize it was through the return of the exiles that God blessed Israel with people who were skilled laborers, tremendously educated, and wise about international realities that those who had remained in the land never could have achieved being there. And yet exile was terrible, and it felt devastating. And the writer of Lamentations even describes this experience as God targeting him with sorrow. He writes, "He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stones. He has made my paths crooked." Well, I mean, clearly, what God was doing was difficult to understand and experience. But the way the author deals with this is by focusing on who God is, even in the midst of inexplicable hardship in the situation of exile. Listen to what the writer says just a few verses later. "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." Well, what does he call to mind? Let's take a look starting at verse 22. "The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him. So it is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord." The what of our experiences is sometimes difficult to understand, and sometimes it's extremely so. But when this is anchored in the unshakable confidence in who God is, we have the courage for today and hope for tomorrow. The final passage in our playlist today is found in Mark chapter 5. And it's the story of the much respected synagogue leader named Jairus and his sick little 12-year-old girl. The point I want to draw out from this text is that in our confident hope, God works things out in his time. Many of you may know this story from Mark's Gospel. The reputation of Jesus as a healer and a teacher was spreading around the area of Galilee. And when he came to a particular town, the synagogue leader named Jairus came to meet him and told him that his little girl was close to death, and that if Jesus would just come to his house and lay hands on her, he was sure that she would live. I mean, clearly Jairus believed in Jesus. He believed in him as a healer, believed in him as a teacher. He believed that Jesus was someone whom God was close to. But you see, as Jesus was making his way to Jairus' house, a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years just thought, if I just touch his garment, and she did, and she was healed. But the thing is, Jesus felt the power leave his body, and he stops abruptly in the midst of this great crowd, and he says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples are, of course, a bit dumbfounded by Jesus' question because the crowd was pressing against him in all directions. And yet Jesus persisted, looking around. He wasn't going anywhere until he found out who it was who touched him. And eventually the woman confesses that she touched him. She touched him hoping that she would be healed. She acknowledges in front of everyone that, in fact, she was healed. And Jesus tells her that it was her faith that saved her. Now, the problem in the text is that Jairus was waiting for Jesus to heal his daughter while Jesus was making a big deal of somebody touching his garment in the crowd. And in that short period of time, Jairus' daughter dies. And people come to tell Jairus, "Look, your daughter has died. Just let the teacher go." And Jesus looks into the eyes of Jairus, and he says, just in light of this great miracle that happened, and he tells him not to be afraid, but just believe. By the time Jesus gets to Jairus' house, mourners are already wailing and funeral arrangements are already being, worked on. And Jesus stops everybody, and he takes James and John and Peter, and he brings them into the house. Well, in fact, before that, Jesus says, "Oh, she's just sleeping," and they laugh at him and they mock him. They knew what dead people looked like. They understood death well. And yet Jesus goes into the room with his 3 close friends, and he says to her, "Talitha cum," little girl, get up. And she gets up. And Jesus says, "Get her something to eat. She's hungry." And of course, eating was a sign of someone truly alive. Ghosts don't eat. Visions don't eat. And so we have this double story of Jairus' daughter, a 12-year-old girl risen from the dead by Jesus, and a woman who had to wait 12 years for her healing. Why did she have to wait 12 years? Well, the text doesn't say why, does it? But the writer of Lamentations would agree with John Donne, who says, "All times are his season, the work of his hands." All of this is in God's time. And so where do we go from here, from all these texts and about the liminal space? Space in between. Space where we are waiting. And perhaps we're like the woman waiting 12 years to be rid of a debilitating situation. Or perhaps our situation is like Jairus, having to deal with a beloved child with an illness or condition, and we don't understand why. And the news all seems bad. Certainly, the woman with the hemorrhage didn't understand why. No doubt Jairus didn't understand why. And sometimes the whys, don't come in time. Certainly the Jews in exile did not understand the why in their time. But when Cyrus set the captives free and they came back to their homeland, everything came into focus. Did it lighten the suffering of the generations previous? No. Did it make it easier for everybody? No. But what it did was save a nation. What it did was prepare a people not only for a new future, but for the Messiah to come. In-between places are often difficult places. Liminal space is often difficult to endure. But if we can pause, if we can capture the moment in our hearts and minds and truly wait on God, trusting that God is who He is, even in the midst of unexpected ends, we can have this unshakable confidence that God will work things in His time. In this in-between moment, we can remain faithful, waiting. Relevant, practical, authentic. River of Life.